Welcome, everybody, to our H2 Talk, a series organized by Hydrogen Europe with a focus on special topics very, very relevant for the hydrogen world, for the hydrogen sector. And today we will talk about REDIII, the Renewable Energy Directive, third recast, and how this is implemented. We want to understand how the national paths for this, especially for the transport targets, that's one of the sub-targets within REDIII, are basically followed, built up, and shaped by the member states. And in order to get there, I will explain a little bit where we are. My name is Yorgos Chatzimarkakis. I'm the CEO of Hydrogen Europe. And to be honest, we were very proud to have REDIII. That was one of the major cornerstones of the Fit for 55 package, the European Green Deal. And there was a hard fight for the targets that we have within REDIII. And I would like to guide you through some of the current aspects, because the deadline for member states to implement REDIII ended 21st of May. Let's see where they are. And if we have a look at the current status of the REDIII implementation, because it's a directive, it needs to be transposed into national law, the member states are definitely lagging behind. Only 2 out of 27 EU member states managed to transpose the RFNBO, so the Renewable Fuels of Non-Biological Origin mandate, into law for both the transport and the industrial use of green hydrogen, basically, into the law. We are not focusing on the industrial use today, which is 42% of any hydrogen used in the industries that are mentioned, because this is a difficult for some member states target. So we focus today on the transport target. However, it was the countries that said from the very beginning, especially in the case of Czech Republic, this is not going to work. Please be careful. And yet it's Romania and Czech Republic that have implemented fully REDIII. Congratulations. I am today in Athens, and here was a big conference on gas infrastructure, and the Romanian responsible Vice Minister, Cristian Bușoi, who was a colleague in the European Parliament many years ago, and he was also leading the ITRO committee. He was there. I could congratulate him, and I did so. Further, 2 countries transposed only the elements linked to the use of the RFNBO in the transport sector. That's Finland and Denmark. That's why we have them here in yellow in that graph. And transposing the quota in industry is complex. Member states are obliged, the obliged party, but not all countries are affected equally by the obligation. But there is no excuse, basically, for the status of transposition in the transport sector. Here, you need to transpose it. And again, only 4 countries have done the effort. So that's the next slide. And let's look at the key issues to look out for when transposing these targets and how to ramp it up. Let's start with the very positive example, and that's France, because France has not only said we would go to 1.5%, so 1.5% of all fuels used in the transport sector, the road transport sector, should be based on the use of green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, in the refining process. No, France has a trajectory until the year 2035, and that is a very, very good practice. We would like to highlight here. This is very good. But the other countries like Denmark and Czech Republic, well, we are not here to judge, but this practice is basically stopping at a certain target, and that's it. And Finland and Romania, however, have a trajectory that goes up, which is a good practice also. So here you see that there is different approach to these targets, and the expectation to produce even more hydrogen can be seen in some countries. It is important for the hydrogen sector because other relevant off-taking mechanisms so far did not work enough. But this here is a very promising one. Let's look at the key issues on the next slide. So the key issues to look out for is especially the approach to the so-called refinery route. If we limit the use of the renewable hydrogen in refineries, this could jeopardize some advanced projects because some countries or some projects are already more advanced. If we look on the right-hand side, the refining sector is by far the biggest sector using hydrogen, and there are some under construction clean hydrogen production projects that you can see here. Most of them that are basically projected are in the refining process. Second biggest group is steel. Then we have other industry, 15%, mobility, only 4%, and some other applications. Around half of all renewable hydrogen projects under constructions are developed in this sector, in the refining sector as the main off-taker, which is very natural. Hydrogen is used in the refining sector, and to replace gray hydrogen, as we called it earlier, to replace it by renewably produced hydrogen is a very, very promising path. The GHG savings of replacing gray hydrogen at the refinery are on par with use of renewable hydrogen directly as a fuel to end users. So it's very good. However, there were some ministers in member states, some of them not in office anymore, because there have been elections since then and they are out of office. But they said back then, if we use hydrogen, green hydrogen, in the refining process, this might cause a lock-in effect into combustion mobility. We don't want that. I remember the Dutch minister saying that. Well, theoretically, you can argue like that, but practically, it's honestly not very wise. Why? Because you block a possibility to reduce the decarbonization, the greening of molecules, where this is possible right now and right away. So it didn't really help this approach by the Dutch minister, who's out of office again. Refineries, as the main offtake of hydrogen in Europe, can be a facilitator of the development of the renewable hydrogen market at a relatively low cost. And you can see on the right-hand side at the graphs and the bars here that the hydrogen demand in the refineries is around 4.5 million tons. The REDIII 1% target is lower than 1 million tons. So if we go ahead and combine this with other targets, other sub-targets that we have in REDIII, we might get much, much more outcome. And this is what we want to discuss today. Let's see next slide on, let's look at some other key issues to look out for, how to approach the so-called refinery route. So the use of hydrogen in the desulfurization process. So limiting the use of green hydrogen in refineries, as I said, could jeopardize some advanced projects. And that is why some countries have no constraints at all. We can see in the current legislation or discussion thereof that there are no constraints in Czech Republic, Romania, Denmark, Netherlands, and France. But there are limits to the use of the refinery route for the green hydrogen for Refinobio compliance. In Finland, there's a cap of 1% for the 4% total Refinobio target. And there's a correction factor of 0.4 in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands seem to have reversed its proposal to introduce a correction factor. Let's see whether this might be changed again, as the Netherlands is one of the top countries in refining and plays a very crucial role here. Let's go to the next slide, which continues to analyze the key issues. And this is the penalty for non-compliance. The level of a penalty is always a key for providing the necessary regulatory certainty that is needed for the final investment decisions. And here on the right-hand side, you have an illustrative example of setting up the penalty in some of the member states. So again, we would start to judge a little bit. So we see a good practice so far in Czechia. Czech Republic is setting the penalty at a level clearly high enough to stimulate action. That's quite high. Romania, the penalty is not in a compliance option. The missing Raffinobio amount needs to still be supplied next year. There's not a good practice in Denmark, where the law only says that not fulfilling the obligation makes a company liable to be fined, but the penalty is not defined at all. So this is basically not such a good practice. And well, can I say I'm surprised? Denmark is one of the leading countries, of course, in renewables. And that's why we would have hoped and thought that Denmark could really be a role model, as it has much more renewables than, for instance, the Czech Republic. But you can see here the difference of approach. The last slide shows that we are, as Hydrogen Europe, producing at the moment and will publish very, very soon a position paper, which gives some guidance on the implementation of REDIII in the transport sector. So in order to support member states in transposing the directive, because it is still complicated. I tried here in my first summary to simplify it, but we will try to give some guidance also out of our industry perspective in the coming weeks. And we will publish this guidance note covering aspects such as how to define the target, how to set the penalties at the right level so that there is a clear incentive to invest into this option. And on the other hand, penalty should never be that high that it destroys, of course, business, but it should be a clear incentive. And there are ways to do that. We need also to have a common approach to the so-called refinery route, so that all member states have a similar path that they go. And we need also to have a credit trading mechanism. What if one country is much better than it should? It could sell basically the credits, and this trading mechanism needs to be defined and needs to be continued. I would add one point here also, the trajectory. So the French example that the trajectory goes up would also be a very, very interesting aspect. And we will dwell on this. And I'm sure that during the Hydrogen Week, that starts 29 of September this year, with a high-level conference with already 5 commissioners that will be joining us there. We will come up with concrete proposals and hope to win the European Commission to take over a job of moderation, because this is very, very crucial here. That brings me to our panel today, and that brings me to our first keynote speaker. If we go to the next slide, we will see it's Łukasz Kolinski. He is the Director for Green Transition and Energy System Integration at DG Ener, at the relevant directorate of the European Commission. Łukasz has worked previously as head of unit for renewables and energy system integration, but he also was head of unit for economic analysis and financial instruments within the same DG. He served as a special advisor on energy union to Donald Tusk, and when he was president of the European Council. So Łukasz is a very, very experienced not only speaker, but also policymaker. And it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you here, Lukasz Cześć. We are happy to have you here. And I'd like to give you the floor for your keynote.
Thank you very much, Jorgo. Thanks a lot, first of all, for the invitation and the kind words, and thanks to the whole Hydrogen Europe for organizing this discussion, this panel on the transposition of the RED and in particular the transport sector, which we all know is quite challenging. Maybe I will take a little bit a step back. I have seen you kind of jumped into the details of the implementation, but just for the sake of standing on the same ground in terms of context, maybe just a few words on the directive itself, as in terms of what we see as very important as we go with the implementation. And first of all, from our perspective, the success in terms of decarbonization of transport is crucial for the decarbonization of economy. And the main reason, obviously, is its weight in the final energy consumption. It's basically 1/3, and then also very high share, basically a quarter in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And obviously, to a very, very large extent, the sector is dependent today on fossil fuels. On the one hand, we obviously see in the sector the electrification route for certain kind of subsectors, such as, I don't know, passenger cars, for example. But you heard us saying a number of times that in other subsectors, which are much more hard to abate, where emissions are much more hard to abate, for us, there is no doubt we need also the uptake of renewable and low carbon fuels. And that is mainly relevant in aviation and maritime. Now, you did mention the target in the Renewable Energy Directive. The important thing from our perspective, and let me once again stress this, is the flexibility for the member states, either achieving the target through the reduction of emission intensity of transport fuels or through the share of renewable energy consumption. Plus, there is this other provision, other element there, the target on the RFNBOs or sub-target on RFNBOs, and that is also there to kind of drive the consumption, drive the demand for these fuels overall. Now, obviously, this is only one piece of the transport decarbonization framework. The extension of the ETS to maritime and aviation transport is the other one. You have also the revised CO2 standards for transport, the Fuel EU Maritime Refuel Aviation. We all know. This is a relatively comprehensive kind of legislative structure which is pushing the decarbonization of this transport. Now, to contribute towards the transport targets, the important thing is that the RFNBOs must deliver a minimum of 70% of emission savings. And then you have two main pathways for compliance. Firstly, RFNBOs can count towards national targets if they are supplied to any transport mode, including international marine bunkers within the member state's territory, or alternatively, RFNBOs can be used as intermediate products for the production of conventional transport fuels and biofuels. And as an example, renewable hydrogen use in refineries or in the production process for biodiesel illustrates how RFNBOs can be integrated. They need to be accounted for in the country where these intermediates are used and not where conventional fuels or biofuels are produced. And while the directive clearly sets out how RFNBOs can count towards our targets when used as intermediates, I have to admit the directive is less clear on how to actively encourage their use in the transport sector. That's what it is. One possible way, obviously, would be to use a similar approach for RFNBO suppliers as the one outlined in Article 25 for renewable electricity suppliers for electric vehicles. This would create a more consistent, more efficient pathway to accelerate the decarbonization of transport across the EU. And if you want to get into the details of this approach, we have produced the guidance documents towards the end of last year, which provides it. But now, from my perspective, from the perspective of the Commission, the good provisions are only good when they are, and in particular when we're talking about the directive, when they are translated, transposed into national legislation, and then put in motion. And here, you know that we are closely monitoring the transposition process. You know that the deadline for the transposition of these provisions that I mentioned fell on 21st of May. And we are urging member states in order to transpose it. And that basically tells you, no, not all member states transposed the directive. So as of today, only one member state out of 27 declared full transposition. And we have 10 member states which declared partial transposition. And I don't need to add that this is a situation that is very suboptimal, that is a concern for us, and we will act, as Commission should, in order to ensure that the provisions are in place. When we're looking, however, at a bit forward, into the NECPs, we received 24 final drafts, and half of them explicitly sets RFNBO targets in transport, while some of them provide more generic figures for installed capacity for electrolyzers by 2030. And we're absolutely aware of, based also on these plans, of regional and national differences, and again, that's the reason we kind of feel vindicated in a sense in this flexible approach to the target, to the renewable target for renewables in transport, which allows adaptation to country-specific conditions. And we see that some member states are setting very ambitious targets. Other member states are taking a little bit a different route. But again, what is important, and where we count also on your support, is the timely implementation of the provisions, because without this, we will be discussing about good legislation a little bit in abstracto. Member states, based on the legislation, need to provide the necessary support to companies by taking into account the impact on the company's competitiveness when setting up the RFNBO mandatory consumption targets. And there are a number of key European measures in place or under preparation to help the ramp-up of RFNBOs, including in transport. Most notably, let me mention the European Hydrogen Bank auctions, with the second auction results, which we have just announced. We're working on a hydrogen mechanism to match supply and demand. We expect this to kick off in September 2025. And that comes next to, obviously, other European funding support, for example, under the Resilience and Recovery Fund. And that is part, this is only a part of the enabling framework, if you like, which supports the legislative obligation from the directive. In order to ensure this timely transposition of the revised Renewable Energy Directive, we have been so far closely working with the member states in different ways. I mentioned this guidance that we produced last year. That was a result of basically meetings and discussions with the member states on the challenges, also on the challenges in the transport sector. And we try to focus the guidance on some of those. The colleagues also engaged in bilateral meetings with the member states again in order to cater for national specificities. We have a Q&A tool where the member states can ask technical questions and can relatively quickly get a reply from us, and and that reply is also shared with other member states so that everyone can benefit from the experience of let's say front runners. We have the concerted action on renewable energy sources, which is a forum where we discuss with the member states the implementation of the legislation. I believe I've been involved in that in the previous years. I believe it can prove highly effective cooperation forum, communication channel, exactly on the type of challenges that the member states face in the implementation of the RFNBO's sub-target and obligations now. Additionally, we have been also providing support to the member states under the Acceleres initiative, including on shortening the permitting procedures, which I believe are also important from the point of view of the project promoters, since, well, very often across the EU member states, the permitting, the project preparation time because of the permitting procedure takes too long. So concluding, I'd like to stress that we have well-established comprehensive legal framework to move ahead with the cost-efficient decarbonization of the transport sector. On RFNBOs, we will be focusing now on the implementation and making work of this framework. And once again, Jorgo and everyone here, please do help us in pressing the member states to ensure that the provisions are put in place, because for the moment, most of the member states are not there yet. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thanks very much indeed. Very comprehensive and clear point of view of the European Commission. And yes, we will help. We will try to do our best to support, because Hydrogen Europe has now over 620, more than 620 members, among which also regions. Some regions are very much dependent on this hydrogen development, and it is good for them. Some of them have close ties, of course, to the national capitals, and so it makes sense to bring all things together. I have already two questions for you as our keynote speaker, because we can help a lot, but infringement procedures, of course, also play a role. And I have two questions. One related to REDIII, to the second recast of Renewable Energy Directive, because also in REDIII transposition, we see that some member states did not transpose into national law. Do you expect this ever to develop? And are there also infringement actions planned? But more importantly, it's to ask about REDIII now. So what would happen, I have a question in the chat here, if the member states were unable to meet the RFNBO mandate by 2030, would the EU impose any penalties on the member states in such a case? Let's try to avoid this. And again, it's a collaborative approach here. But what if? That's the question here.
Yeah, so I mean, first on the transposition, the deadline has passed. The infringements are obviously one of the routes, or if you like, the tools that we use. Let me reply in this manner. So part of the directive had a different transposition deadline for mid last year, the permitting procedures. We had a similar situation. The infringements were launched almost immediately, and now we are very much already, well, a few member states complied with this. Other member states advanced very much. In the meantime, we are steaming ahead with, that the infringement has different steps, right? in terms of severity of our action. And we are not shying away from using this tool. So as I mentioned, this is a very important directive for us, and this is and its implementation is also crucial, not only in view of 2030, but also preparing the framework, going beyond, let's say, and second, also it's very important in terms of competitiveness and affordability, and that's of these sectors where the emissions are hard to abate, preparing the ground, let's say, or moving the transition forward. So we are going to be rather robust on this. And please don't ask me what will happen in 2030. You are absolutely right. I think that at this stage what we want to focus on is that, well, first the framework is set, that it's put in motion, and then we will be doing everything possible for basically the development of the market of renewable and low carbon hydrogen with the tools that we have, directly, indirectly working through the member states, with the member states, and then we see how things develop. I mean, what I can say maybe as a last phrase is that even if we hear that some people are saying, okay, shouldn't we go down maybe with the sub targets? I can tell you, we believe that they are extremely important in terms of creating demand for RFNBOs, and therefore we do not plan kind of going down with the ambition. On the contrary, again, let's focus on the implementation. What is down there? What we kind of all agreed upon. I hope that I replied at least partially.
Yes, you did, and you also covered some of the ongoing questions, whether the targets will be lower, and you said no, let's try to keep them high, and it's very important, Lukasz. Maybe I can explain a little bit that especially the producers of electrolyzers in our world, European electrolyzers, are expecting, of course, this market. It's super important. Why? Because we are competing on a global scale, of course, with other geographies, especially with China. This is very well known. And we have lost the solar industry. We are about to lose wind. We have lost battery, EVs, slide off, and sort of. And the problem is that in electrolyzers, other than the Draghi report said 1.5 years ago, we are losing possibly ground if we don't fix this problem. So it is in our own interest to act here together. And we will hear later on from member states, but also from some companies, from the industry, about the readiness to adapt to the situation. But I'm very happy, Lukasz, to have had you here. Also, we will share our ideas about the credit market. So that might enable some of the member states to really make some more efforts. And we would really like to exchange our findings here with you in order to help. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Lukasz. And with this, I would like to start to go to the member states, and would like to start with one of the good examples. We have only good examples here today, but that's Finland. And we have Pekka Grönlund, who is the Deputy Director General in the Finnish Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment and the Energy Department. We later on have Mark Makare. He is the Renewable Energy Policy Officer in the Dutch Ministry for Infrastructure and Water Management, and he is Director General for Mobility and the Sustainable Mobility Program. Then we turn to the industry. Shirley Oliveira, she's the Vice President Hydrogen and CCUS Regulatory Affairs at BP. We will also have, in the end, Nadine Kanu. She is representing Enatrac. She's Head of Energy Policy and Vice President at the German Association of Renewable Energy. And happy to also have an outside look into Europe by Alexei Tatarenko, Senior Principal for Hydrogen at the Rocky Mountain Institute. But without further ado, I would like to invite Pekka from the Finnish Ministry to share with us, with his over 15 years of experience in the energy sector and being a real expert on REDIII, and also representing Finland in international renewable energy policy fora. Why is Finland one of the few countries that managed to transpose RED in time and one of the first ones to do so in the EU? What stands out, dear Pekka, from the way Finland chose to transpose the RED in transport sector? And is the relatively high RFNBO sub-target in the transport sector of 4%, that's the Finnish example, in road transport, how can you get there? Can you explain how did you arrive at such an ambitious level? Terve, dear Pekka, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So maybe a few reasons why Finland decided to set such an ambitious RFNBO sub-target within the National Distribution Obligation Scheme. So Finland has had a quite long-standing tradition of strong policy instruments in the transport sector since the introduction of National Distribution Obligation in early 2008. The mandate levels have consistently been well above the minimum requirements set by the EU legislation. Our main or broader objective is to promote renewable energy and reduce emissions, of course, particularly in the effort sharing sector. However, at the same time, we aim to accelerate new investments in renewable transport fuels. Even though Finland is a relatively small market, we believe that establishing strong domestic demand early on is essential. And we have seen this approach actually work quite well before, especially with the renewable diesel. So we see this RFNBO targets maybe as a continuation to our previous policies concerning especially biofuels. So now Finland aims also becoming one of the leading countries in the production of clean hydrogen and synthetic fuels. We have excellent conditions for hydrogen production. We have clean and low-cost electricity with strong potential for future renewable expansion, especially wind power, supported by strong and reliable transmission network. And in addition, we have a significant availability of biogenic CO2. So also very good position for producing synthetic fuels. We see ambitious mandates as a key tool to unlock critical offtake agreements, which we all know that this is probably the biggest uncertainty for project developers at the moment. And by providing predictability and guaranteed demand, we aim to reduce investment risk and accelerate these investments. Thanks.
Thank you. That sounds very good. So the geographical factors and your experience play clearly a role here. We will elaborate on this later on, Pekka. And we turn to the Netherlands to look into another very interesting case. Mark, who is has his focus on hydrogen and renewable energy carriers in mobility in his ministry, and has a background in chemical engineering, innovation sciences. What about the Netherlands? The Netherlands is it's in the unique position, considering that the maritime transport is around 50% of the entire transport sector, only 10% on average in the EU, but therefore facilitating RFNBOs in the maritime sector, uptake in the maritime sector, will be an important requirement if the Netherlands wants to reach the required RFNBO market share. How are you planning to approach this, dear Mark? And how does that interplay with the RED III transport target? Mark, you have the floor.
All right, thank you for the question. So what we will do while implementing the RED III is set sub-targets for fuel suppliers to the different sectors, so to road transport, to inland shipping, as well as the maritime sectors, including interim goals. The RED III allows flexibility on how to distribute the RFNBO sub-target over sectors, or just include the general RFNBO target. But as we want to stimulate uptake of direct use of RFNBOs in the various sectors, we have chosen for sector-specific targets. What we've done there as well is to ensure a level playing field is that for the maritime sector, we set the RFNBO sub-target in line with the goals from FuelEU Maritime, and we've set up an MOU with Belgium for a level playing field concerning the RFNBO sub-targets for both inland shipping and the maritime sector. So, and one final thing to add here is that to these sub-targets, which are sector-specific, the refinery route can also contribute.
That answers already my second question I would have later on. So did the Dutch government come up to a clear position on the refinery route? You say yes.
Yes, I think there's more to say there concerning the correction factor, but I don't know if you want to save that for the next part.
Second round. Okay, let's
Sure.
talk about that in the next. Now let's turn to industry, and let's possibly start with BP, being a possible investor or producer of hydrogen, and also consumer, because BP needs in the refining process lots of hydrogen. Shirley Oliveira is Vice President of Hydrogen and CCUS. She is based in London and has over 20 years of experience in the energy industry. She had a variety of leadership roles within BP, spanning from environmental sustainability over regulatory compliance. She is absolutely the right person in the big BP to give us an answer to the following question. What geographies are you looking at for the implementation of RED III that we just discussed? What can you tell us about the importance of the RED III transport target, which is our main topic today? And what are your expectations regarding the size of the market for hydrogen-based fuels in your respective geographies? Dear Shirley, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jorgo, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And first, I want to thank you for all the work that Hydrogen Europe and the Commission and various member states have been doing in this space. I think it's, we've seen progress, and since I've been leading BP's hydrogen regulatory affair team since 2020, we've seen that so much has been achieved. So I think it's important also to point out that. And in terms of BP, we have refineries in Spain, the Netherlands, and Germany. So these are important markets for us to try to understand as a user what the regulations and the obligations will be for us. And in relation to production, which is where I've been more focused on, is we're very committed to making green hydrogen a success in Europe. And this is shown by two projects where we have taken FIDs last year, both for green hydrogen. One in Spain for 25 megawatts in partnership with Iberdrola. And this will aim to supply our Castellón refinery. And again, here, refinery and road transport sector, very important. And in Germany, in Lingen, we have taken FID on a 100 megawatts project. And this one we will aim to supply the market, but also we are in a fortunate position of having as a off-taker of last resort our own refinery. So again, here what happens in terms of RED III transposition is absolutely crucial for the financial viability of these two, green hydrogen production projects. And RED III transport and industry compliance mandates are really the foundations to establish the hydrogen market in Europe. So for us, I think we need to make sure that the transposition continues to drive value and demand for the green hydrogen in the transport sector. In terms of our view of the market, so as you already mentioned, I won't go through that. We know that refineries are among the biggest hydrogen consumers in the EU. From our perspective, from the BP Energy Outlook Central Scenario, and the Energy Outlook is a publication anybody can have a look at, where we look at energy trends and supply and demand across various vectors around the world. So we are assuming that about 0.5% of physical volumes of RFNBO, we estimate around 100,000 KTPA hydrogen equivalent for Germany and about 90,000 KTPA hydrogen for Spain. This is the 2024 Energy Outlook. So we also think that in the early years of the market development, anything between 80 to 100% of all the RFNBO would be used for the intermediate route, therefore into road transport. And effectively, this means is that it will be displacing grey hydrogen as a feedstock for the production of conventional transport fuels, such as diesel, and may also be used for biofuels. So, and from our analysis, we also think that, our view is that the replacements of grey hydrogen consumption in refineries would lead to, a small increase in the cost of conventional fuels, whereas the greenhouse gas emission reductions is comparable with the greenhouse gas saving of RFNBO hydrogen used directly in transport. So we see that this is a very good trade-off. We have an existing user. It would not add, too much to the cost. But of course, this means that it's really critical that 100% of all green hydrogen is used in the refineries as an intermediate can count towards the transport target. And this is a key point for the transposition of RED III, and to enable the success of our production projects, as well as having a demand that is able to, that has the ability to pay for the green hydrogen, and there are not many sectors who can do that.
Excellent. So very clear message that you can contribute via refinery route by replacing grey with green. Let me use the colors, although I don't like. We can contribute highly to decarbonization targets of Europe. That's good, because as you are your own producer and consumer, to a certain extent, that is already a strong message. Let's now come to a pure producer of renewable hydrogen. And let's turn to Nadine Kanu. She is Energy Policy Communication Specialist at ENERTRAG, and since 2018 she works as head of department communications and marketing at this company. It's a German company. She's also co-opted board member of the German Renewable Energy Federation, BEE. My question to you, Nadine, is quite similar. What geographies are you looking at for the implementation of RED III? We heard that BP is looking to Spain and Germany as major geographies, interesting geographies for making the kickoff, overcoming the chicken and egg dilemma. What can you tell us about the importance of RED III for your business and especially the transport target for your activities? What are your expectations regarding the size of the market for hydrogen-based fuels in your respective geographies? It's a similar question. Nadine, you have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me as well, or in that case, inviting ENERTRAG. For those who might not know ENERTRAG, we are active in 4 continents and in a lot of countries, not only in Europe. We are developing in the gigawatt scale projects of renewable energies and green hydrogen. And we our goal is always to have a very system integrated approach. So coming to your questions, for us, since the nature is a producer, so to say, we also look at the REDIII in 2 dimensions. One is the acceleration of the permitting of the renewables, that is key. And the second one is basically that we say that there is a demand created or induced for the transportation in the industry sector. Today we concentrate on the industry sector, but of course we always look at both, and therefore I want to bring here and there the perspective also into the discussion. So we are focusing currently on 6 European countries, and the main ones are Germany, Netherlands, Poland, but especially when we open the scope more towards transportation, then we would include France, Spain, and Italy, of course. We are not BP, so our focus is partly also we had 1,200 employees, so our focus is certainly also due to our coverage, our ability to coverage. So that's why I would never exclude other countries, other European out of it. So yeah, I think the main thing is, of course, we are facing delays, and of course, when we have delays, we don't know really the goals, the targets that those member states are setting. That's why I have a little bit how to say, I find it a little bit difficult to really say what the market size is at what year, right? So I would not. I know that in Germany right now, they aim in implementing or transposing the REDIII by Q1 26, which is, I think, a very good sign. And some of the permitting issues they will even finalize before summer. So we will not have a gap in the emergency implementation, so to say. I would first of all stop here and rather have the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more later on. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Thanks very much, dear Nadine. Let's now turn to a look from the outside. Alexei Tatarenko has a different time of the day. I think he had to stand up quite early. And he's a senior principal in the Climate Aligned Industries program at Rocky Mountain Institute. This institute is tracking the developments in the EU very, very well, and is looking slightly from the outside to it, which is very interesting for us. How do you approach this? How do you see, dear Alexei, the European efforts here? Too complex, not ambitious enough? What are your expectations of the market size in the Renewable Energy Directive, and what will it cause for the renewable hydrogen? Maybe you can also allude to this wonderful big magnificent bill that is discussed in the US right now, and whether, that would be my question also, whether this has an impact, because hydrogen is clearly affected by this bill that passed, I think, with 1 vote more last week, 1 house already, Senate still to discuss it. You have the floor, Alexei.
Thank you, Jorgo, and thanks for this invitation to speak. And look, I mean, maybe the first thing that I would explain is that we do have the global presence. I mean, my team is working on the US, but also it's working on Europe, on India and China, and we recently started, being engaged in Brazil too. So I'll be speaking from the breadth of that experience and work that we are doing in various geographies. Maybe we'll touch upon this global picture more in the second round, and we'll zoom in right now more on Europe and our most recent report, which essentially calling for recalibration of the EU hydrogen strategy. And the reason, just to give 2 words on the context here of why we came up with this report, the reason why we took stock on where we are with European hydrogen strategies. On one hand, it's like 5 years since the hydrogen strategy in Europe was adopted back in 2020. But the second reason, and probably more important for this discussion, was that we also felt that this gap between initial ambition of where Europe wanted to be in 2030 and the reality was widening, and we wanted to ask this question is like, hey, what is realistic in 2030 perspective, right? And I think there is a broad recognition within industry, but also among the policymakers, that the reset will be needed, and I think Commission also realizes this. So in a way, this report was also produced in support of that recalibration that in our view will happen inevitably. So we started with demand, looking at different scenarios as we normally do, and one scenario was just looking purely at mandates such as REDIII, Refuel EU, and Fuel EU, and we estimated RFNBO demand by 2030 and ended up with a range somewhere between 2.2 and 2.8 million tons per annum by 2030, right? Not surprisingly, primarily driven by refining and fertilizer sectors, as Shirley, described, these sectors as the ones that will be driving demand that, under RFNBO mandated scenarios, right? And then we looked at the accelerated transition scenario because we were interested to look at like what is within the realm of possible, ambitious yet, still realistic. And there we ended up with, up to 7 million tons per annum by 2030. If public funding, would increase, if we will really start, walking the talk on implementation. And, the sectors that are really can make, a big difference there are essentially, in our view, are steel, aviation, and shipping. So those sectors primarily can add to that, mandated demand, and that's where we see most of the potential. I wouldn't talk about steel because the industry is not in the focus of this discussion beyond refining, and I will focus a little bit on aviation and shipping here. For that reason. But first on refinery route, as a short-term lever, I think we all understand that refineries are going to be crucial early adopters due, to their relatively high willingness to pay, but also their technological readiness to offtake hydrogen here and now. But in the longer term, we see refinery route, will act essentially as a stepping stone, while, this real ramp up in aviation and shipping will be, driving the market, further toward that accelerated scenario. So in aviation, well, I think we can see the potential of, up to 1 million tons of hydrogen demand by 2030. Again, in the accelerated transition scenario, which, will be equivalent to, if you would translate this just to eSAF, that will be equivalent to 2 million tons of eSAF. But then, of course, you need to make a reality check of where we are now. I think in the mandated scenario, we are talking about, 1.2% of eSAF by 2030. And that translates into 600,000 tons per year, right? Which is like 12 medium-sized eSAF plans. So there is a big, range there between that 600,000 tons potentially and 2 million tons. And by the way, 2 million tons corresponds, largely with 30 large-scale, medium-scale eSAF projects that, have been announced in the EU. But then, once you do the reality check, none of those projects has reached FID, right? And it's important to understand why. And, the reason is simple. It's, there are many reasons, but the main reason is pretty straightforward. It's economic one, right? Because if you look at the cost of eSAF, and take the range of, 5,000 to 8,000 tons euro per ton, and compare this to Jet A1, which is, under 1,000 euro per ton, closing that gap, will require a big effort, and it will be, interesting to talk later on about, how that can be done, because I think we are a bit in a situation here where we, using that metaphor of carrots and sticks, not only that we don't have enough of sticks, we don't have enough of carrots here in the UK, and will be interesting to reflect on that. And then on shipping, wrapping up here, we see the maritime sector could drive up to 1.4 million tons of hydrogen demand by 2030. The interesting thing here to watch out for will be how the IMO regulations will shape up in October, because we think that IMO measures can be at the very least as ambitious as FuelEU, but potentially even more ambitious. And, IMO targets will be defined on a short term until 2035, in comparison to FuelEU, which is like more targeting 2050. But, in that shorter term, they're also, more ambitious in terms of direct compliance and base target for that first period, which is raising an interesting question. And as you know, IMO regulations, even if passed in October, would still require lots of, guidances being developed in that time frame of 2025 to 2027. So it will be interesting to see how European Commission will monitor and then, drive convergence between FuelEU and IMO regulations. And as you know, there is a provision in FuelEU that allows to sunset, FuelEU if IMO regulations will be more ambitious. But to sum all of this up, I think the key message here is that, it shouldn't be longer about, the ambition. It all should be about execution and how we close that widening gap.
Many thanks. It's very interesting to have this global look upon the different targets, and to see that the transport target in the REDIII that we are talking about here is the stepping stone, as you called it. So it's important, but the real market, as far as I understand, comes with aviation and maritime. By the way, we have to see how the IMO later in autumn will decide about the different pathways. The fundamental decision has been taken. Interesting to see how this will be implemented. However, you also referred to the refinery route. I would like to come back to Finland, to Pekka, and to ask about this refinery route, because the Finnish government has decided to cap this refinery route at 1% of the market share, versus the overall RFNBO target of 4%. Can you explain what were your considerations when deciding to cap this? And when setting the exact level of the cap, where do you see the greatest challenges for Finland in fulfilling these targets? Pekka.
Yeah, thank you. So we wanted to ensure that the national target provides a strong incentive for actual production of RFNBOs used directly as transport fuels, so not just intermediates. We see that these fuels offer a higher added value than intermediate products. And when we take a longer term perspective, for example, as you just mentioned about the maritime transportation, the potential for such fuels are substantial. At the same time, we fully recognize the the need for decarbonizing refinery production, and there is also urgent need to shift from the existing fossil-based hydrogen to clean hydrogen. And in this context, it's important to note that even though we have the cap, but it's actually the 1% is corresponding to the actual REDIII minimum for RFNBO, so it's still quite high. But for these reasons, we decided to choose like a balanced approach, allowing the refinery route to a limited extent, but still ensuring that the majority of the target supports the production of end-use transport fuels. And to the second question about the maybe the main challenges, so maybe the greatest challenge or worry is, of course, having enough production to meet the target, because as mentioned already in some of the speakers, there's not too many investment decisions yet. And in our view, the main problem is the overall uncertainty of the market. Some of the mandates have already been set. For example, the EU-wide aviation maritime mandates, and there has been a lot of state aid in the field, but the investment decisions are still being delayed. And in many cases, it's not due to a lack of funding or technical feasibility, but because the developers are facing too high uncertainty, causing especially stable offtake. And without clear demand signals and regulatory certainty, it's difficult to move from plans to actual investments. And this is exactly why we have chosen to include ambitious and binding targets to reduce the risk and send the clear message that there will be at least home market for these fuels. In this note, I must say that I'm a little bit afraid of the current situation that we heard just now. We definitely aim to be one of the first ones, but we don't want to be one of the only ones. So we need EU-wide adoption of these so that the market signs are actually there. Thanks.
Fully understandable. That's also in our interest. And Kiitos paljon. Thanks very much to the Finnish government to really go into that direction and to show the right direction. But I'm sure you will not be the only one. But let's hear from the Netherlands. Let's hear from Mark. Mark, you referred to the sub-targets. You referred to road inland shipping, very important also, not to be underestimated, not only in Dutch perspective, and of course the maritime. I would like to focus a little bit on this maritime target. The maritime target, you have here a sub-quota of 1.2%. Is that included in the minimum of 1% transport target or not? You referred already to the refinery route as the way to go. We have heard about the Dutch government going for new elections. Let me just ask, would that be threatened again? I mean, because it had to a certain extent also to do with change in government here. What's your gut feeling? It's very difficult to say. I mean, it's a very, very current development in the Netherlands, but what's your gut feeling? Will the refinery route stay the way you have explained it? Mark.
Okay, so I heard two questions. The first one was regarding our targets for the maritime sector. Yes, and there we saw within the REDIII a target, well, a request to endeavor to ensure 1.2% RFNBO uptake in the maritime sector, and there's a 1% target, also a rather soft target in FuelEU Maritime. Ultimately, we've converted this into a target that should account for 1.72 petajoules of RFNBO uptake in the maritime sector or through the refinery route in 2030. Then, looking at the impact of the fall of government. So, of course, this is really new, this information, but we will be going ahead as planned in terms of drafting our proposals and submitting them to the House of Representatives ultimately, it will be up to the House of Representatives to decide the handling of this topic. So they will decide whether it's deemed controversial or not. Obviously, we will argue that given there's a deadline for transposition, which has already passed, that there's no room for further delay, and it needs to be handled. And that's the premise that we'll be working from now, that we can move forward.
Very good. That gives room for hope. That's very good. Danke wel. I would like to turn to Shirley again and basically ask you, dear Shirley, two questions. One, to comment on the Finnish example. We heard Pekka's explanations. Would you agree that such an approach, like proposed by Finland, should be replicated in other member states? The 1% RFNBO quota is just the minimum level, as the Finnish example has shown, and the member states are free to increase the obligation beyond that. However, since 2030 is just around the corner, to be honest, what would you say are the enabling conditions if member states need to put in place higher ambitions? So what would enable them, except for funding? That's question number one. Question number two is from the chat, refers to your priority, because you said 100% should go into the refinery route, which is understandable, but you also are interested in e-fuels. So is there any priority? So would you also like to put some hydrogen in the e-fuel production? Is there any, don't know, point 1.2 thing that you would tell us here? Thank you.
No, thank you. I think it's good to see member states and examples such as Finland and some of the other proposals we have seen that first set ambitious RFNBO binding targets, and I think at least 1% by 2030 is very helpful. And if possible, I think the case of the French proposal is also very helpful when you look beyond 2030, because as I said earlier, we are building these facilities now. They will, the Spanish plant will start operations by the fourth quarter next year, 26, the German one afterwards, and in 2027, 28. And we really need some certainty in terms of demand. So having the transposition is really critical, and the minimum level of the target, and beyond 2030, because what we're building now are investments for 15, 20 years. They're not investments only for 5 years. And by the time they start operation is 2 or 3 years. So what we think would be really helpful, I think, having intermediate sub-targets from 2027, because this allows both certainty for us and also I think for electrolyzer manufacturers to know what kind of demand there will be there and what kind of electrolyzer capacity will benefit them. The other thing is, I know that this is not REDIII, but I think talking about the RFNBO Delegated Act and also extending the additionality and temporal correlation requirements, because that helps again to lower the cost of production and increase the market penetration of RFNBO hydrogen. And I think the other thing is, what I thought was very helpful with the Finnish presentation was to say, look, when we're looking at ramping up of the obligations, we look at, what is the production that we have, and also what is the ability of the market and the obligated markets to absorb this produced quantity. So setting some targets, making sure we look at what the market looks like, and also making sure that there is some kind of penalty or fair buyout penalty that covers the minimum, green hydrogen production and associated, utilization costs, plus the investment incentives. I would say these are really critical factors, to make sure that we have, we have got certainty for investment. And yes, we are also looking at options of e-fuels, in particular sustainable aviation fuel. That's something we are exploring, and BP is very clear to us that REDIII says 5.5 combined targets, right? with a minimum 1% RFNBO, but 4.5% they're also for bio as well as RFNBO. So we're very clear that there is that option there as well, for us. So we, in our mind, that there's not a hierarchy. We will look at each investment in their own merits and understand how the regulations impact them. But I think just these are our views. So fair, clear target, minimum targets, intermediate sub-targets, looking at the market, making sure there's a fair buyout, and if possible, look beyond 2030.
Very clear. Thanks very much indeed. Also, thanks for your answer on e-fuels. Quite related to what we heard from Alexei with regards to the upcoming big markets, aviation and maritime. Let me turn to Nadine again, also in the industry, but from the other side. What would you think is the main advantages and also drawbacks of the refinery route? And what are the main challenges for your company regarding this mechanisms in place? We just heard from Shirley about also complexity of some regulations. She referred to the Delegated Act, additionality, and the temporal correlation being, she didn't say an obstacle, but it's a factor that makes things a little bit more difficult. So is there a problem in that instinct? We have heard about your project in South Africa. It's far away, but they also have been affected big time by this interpretation of regulation. It's not even the regulation, it's the interpretation of regulation that has blocked your investment. And we have clearly heard from Pekka and from Mark that, yeah, they are looking into final investment decisions. Is there a problem with complex regulations?
Sure. Maybe I will answer in the order you asked me, even though it would be easier to already relate to what Shirley said. But just the point on the refinery road, right? I think the primary advantage is what also has been said. It's technical. Simplicity. And of course, we have a reliable partner in the refineries who kind of add up some financial stability, right, in the whole setup. I think these are all plus, and that's of course why we should use this bridge, and it's an important bridge, but it is not the destination. So if we want to unlock let's say the vast volumes, then we have to also move into maritime and aviation, but also, of course, it's not just about volumes, it's about decarbonization, right? So we would not be sufficient if we don't tackle that. So the drawback is only, it should not, because the one is easier, it shouldn't get out of focus. So we as a company, we are developing projects also for e-methanol and ammonia. So you were referring to South Africa, but also Namibia Hyphen. Some people may know this. So we are looking into how to bring those products into Europe, but also in our German projects where we have IPSAI projects, we have other projects which are more towards refinery. The general thing that we see is what Shirley already addressed, is because what we need is offtake contracts, and offtake contracts are usually not 5 years or 4 like a legislation period of a government. So what we need is the stability, because it pays into bankability, and that's exactly where we have to really do something right now. And the other part is what Shirley also referred to is the RFNBO criteria. Also, it took a long time, I think, when the initial ideas were written down, and I don't know how many versions of them I read before it actually got adopted. So I think also the timelines there then were too overambitious. But still, we should always, because I mentioned we are a company that has also the system integrity of the renewables and the networks, and that the whole thing works in mind, is we also should really consider direct lines for supply, and because we will face with the PV upcoming in all the countries, we will face serious issues with the electricity grids. So this one we certainly have to have in mind. So just as one pointer, it's a discussion in its own, so I will not dive further into it. Thank you.
It's a very important point. I might come back to it in the final outlook of today's debate, but it's important as you say. Thanks very much indeed. Let's now turn into the external view again. Alexis said recalibration of the EU strategy. And I would like to ask about this complexity that was just also highlighted by both, by Nadine and by Shirley, that might hamper basically the offtake, the FIDs in the end, the investment readiness. Is that something you would urge Europeans to look into, especially now after, I think the name is this big, beautiful bill is, well, most probably to come up and to change to a certain extent dramatically the clean tech view, the clean tech outlook in the US, also the hydrogen-related technologies. So should we become less complex in order, I ask you bluntly, in order to attract what will now not be implemented in the US in Europe? Is there a bargain? Alexis.
Yeah, thank you, Jorgen. It's a great framing to start with and reflect on. I think on the one hand, I think very few people will argue or debate here the point that, you know, the EU is a regulatory pioneer, right? I don't think that there is any other region in the world where we have such an integrated and systemic, you know, approach to hydrogen and, you know, such a comprehensive framework. And on its own, that brings a lot of complexity, right, to your point. And at the same time, I also don't want to dismiss, you know, the complexity here in a sense, and recognize that, you know, this complexity that comes with, you know, like how do we balance decarbonization agenda with energy security and industrial competitiveness is very real. And we've heard from multiple speakers today, you know, how different member states are trying to tackle that, right? And yes, this is a challenge for policymakers in all the regions, but I think in the EU, this is especially acute. So I also want to recognize, you know, that there are good reasons why, you know, this discussion is so complex. I'll get back to your question about, you know, how we can cut through this complexity in the end. But first, you know, taking a global perspective. First, you know, on the US, I think, as you know, US was taking, you know, pretty much the approach of like no sticks, lots of carrots, particularly those that, you know, were written into Inflation Reduction Act. And, you know, most of those carrots may disappear soon, right? And you've alluded to that. I don't want to go too deep into that because it's also complex. You know, some of the provisions, you know, may stay, some of them may disappear. I mean, take the aviation, if 45Z stays, but, you know, 45V disappears, then you have probably, you know, the overall like SAF story will continue moving forward, but the SAF story will be, you know, further challenged, right, on economic basis because of hydrogen being a critical input and feedstock there. But it's not all doom and gloom there, because I think the deployment will be driven in this scenario mostly by, you know, state level actions and LCFS, low carbon fuel standards that are set in by now in different states, and not only on the West Coast, but in the West Coast in particular. You know, that will drive you know, soft story for aviation, but also the road transport, you know, and deployment of hydrogen in the road transport. And then it will be, of course, you know, global regulations like IMO regulations coming up for shipping. So I think things will keep on progressing in this scenario, but maybe not with the scale and speed, that we could have here in the US. Then I would also like to turn to China, right? And I think this is a super interesting, actually, example to unpack, and there are some things there to learn, right? First of all, Chinese approach can be described in a very simple but powerful way. It's like deploy, 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 right? It's about domestic manufacturing, leveraging, the huge foundation of renewable and huge, domestic industrial demand, right? And if you translate that approach into transportation sectors, you clearly see how it's working and paying out. And just as a reference point here for us, if you would look at how many battery electric trucks were sold in China and comparing that to EU, I mean, I think it's one order of magnitude. It's like 77,000, in China versus probably around like 11,000 in the EU, right? So, and the same story here may play out, in hydrogen trucks, because already, there are more than 20,000 trucks, fuel cell trucks there on the road in China, and more than 500 stations built. And I think we should be asking the question, how did that happen? What was the recipe of success? And I would argue that was a combination of, on the one hand, clear roadmaps coming from governments and also provincial governments, very targeted performance-based subsidies that are driving this journey, and also, a very comprehensive effort to drive integration in like logistical hubs, in industrial parks, in H2 city clusters. So all of that in combination, allows China to move this at scale, right? Maybe without even having such a comprehensive, framework as there is in the EU. So now then, turning to the EU, I think what's important, and reflecting on the comments of the previous speakers, I think Mark was talking about level playing field. I think the key question here for the EU is, how we jump together. I would argue that, what Mark has described in terms of the efforts between the Netherlands and Belgium to coordinate, I think, is applicable to the whole of the EU. Being Eastern European, I'm, super happy to hear that Romania and, Czech Republic, are charting the way here, and some Nordic countries. But, that raises the question, where is the industrial heart of Europe and the Western Europe, right, with Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and, how does this influence the level playing field? And I think this is super important, because most of the sectors that we are discussing here, either we talk about shipping or aviation or road transport, they're either regional and the competition is regional, or they're global and the competition is global. And that's, super important, for EU member states, I think, to have, a joint up discussion about, hey, how do we jump together and don't distort the level playing field? And just wrapping up on, I think, mandates and penalties, I think it's absolutely crucial, for building confidence in the market, right? I mean, the carrots only approach is not going to work without, penalties and, certainty that mandates will be implemented. Market will falter. It's a simple logical test. If a country acts, for example, Germany and the previous government is saying we will put enough of carrots, then the logical question is like, why wouldn't you complement that with the sticks, right? So I would probably leave us with that thought.
Many, many thanks. It's a very, very good overview. The Chinese example shows us that it's possible if you create expectation and clear targets. There are less penalties, more carrots in China, but it works very well. We exhausted our time. That's why I would like to, first of all, thank you, and also say that the transport targets in RED III are a very, very good first stepping stone. I just summarize what has been said. Even if we would go for the 100% of use of hydrogen, green hydrogen for the refinery route, which is easy to do. Still, we need clear rules by member states. Hydrogen Europe promises that we will help, of course, this process to be enacted, both by the Commission but also by the member states. It's the bread and butter, this refinery route, based on these targets. And I would like to pick up what Nadine said. There is more in this geopolitical turmoils and changes to think about than just implementing some targets. It's the whole issue of resilience. We see that more and more targets that have been set, I personally, some 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, contributed as a policymaker to the liberalization of the energy markets. That was urgently needed back then, but we had a predictability, we had a stability. We don't have that anymore. You can do electrification first and energy efficiency first if you have predictability. We don't have that luxury anymore. We have now an unpredictable situation where you need to create resilience. And it might be that we live the days of a paradigm shift from energy efficiency and electrification first to resilience first, but encompassing energy efficiency, and hydrogen being one major part needs to be initiated. And this is why this refinery route, why these transport targets are so crucial for Europe to become more resilient. Thanks very much indeed. Kitos, dankjewel, vielen Dank, and thanks again for your patience. We had a lot of attendance today. We covered all the questions in the chat, and it was fantastic to listen to you and basically for us to draw the line for the next big steps. And we will not wait until the Hydrogen Week, but at the Hydrogen Week, 29th September to 3rd of October, you will listen more big steps into that direction. Thanks for today. Thanks for this H2 Talk. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.